What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily, and in this video, we're going to be doing a comparison between a used Samsung Galaxy S9 and a new Samsung Galaxy A51 to see which phone might be a better value. So after my S9 versus A71 video yesterday, this was the most requested new comparison that you guys wanted to see, and I think I know why. Unlike the A71, which retails for a significantly higher price, the A51 is a much more affordable phone and comes in even closer to the price of a used S9. Because of that reason alone, I think this is probably my closest and toughest comparison yet. And it's going to be interesting to see how these phones stack up and which device you guys think might be more worth it. The S9, of course, is a couple years old now, but still offers a lot. And while the A51 I think is still a great, relatively new mid-range phone with a lot to offer too, I'm not sure it's enough to hold up against even a 2-year-old flagship. But let's go ahead and see what each of these phones has to offer. So first things first, let's talk about price, since I think that's probably the most important comparison. Right now, you can pick up a renewed S9 on Amazon for right around $254. There are some other listings that have it selling for like $260 or $270. But any which way you go, you can expect to spend well under $300 for a phone that barely 2 years ago was selling for like $750 or $800. Obviously, you're getting a crazy discount on a device that really isn't even that old. With the A51, this phone came out just a couple of months ago. And while it too has actually come down in price just a little, the cheapest I've seen it on Amazon is right around $285. So maybe a tiny bit more expensive than the S9, but we're talking about a difference of like $20 or $30 if that. These prices are super close, and either device can be had for under $300 right now. That pretty much makes price a non-factor in my opinion, and not something that should influence your purchase decision too much. And by the way, if you want to check out any of those deals I just mentioned on the S9 or the A51, I'll have links to all of the Amazon listings and stuff down below, so don't miss out on them if you are interested in getting either of these phones. With price out of the way, let's talk about the design and form factor. It's no secret that yesterday's A71 was a big phone in comparison, but actually the A51 is a pretty big phone in its own right as well, especially compared to the S9. The A51 comes in at 6.5 inches, while the S9 is just a 5.8-inch device. And while I do think the A51 is still relatively comfortable to use, the S9 obviously is significantly easier to handle, especially when you want to use it one-handed. Now, if you're just going with like size alone, I think this is going to be more of a personal preference than anything else. There are a lot of phones that even fall between these two devices as well that might make more sense. But if you're strictly looking at getting the biggest phone with the biggest screen, the A51 is a great option at this price point. However, the bigger screen is only one side of the equation, and there are a few other factors with the displays to take into consideration. First off, each of these phones rocks a totally different design. The A51, since it was released this year, has the refreshed Infinity O display with a small front camera cutout and reduced bezels all the way around, and that gives the phone an 87% screen to body ratio, which is pretty good, especially for a device this inexpensive. The S9's design, on the other hand, is a bit dated now. It has the full top and bottom bezels that outline the screen, and that means you're getting a screen to body ratio of around 84%. It doesn't seem like much of a difference, and for some folks it might even be totally irrelevant, but I do think that while the S9 still looks pretty good, the A51 offers a nicer, newer, more refreshed look. One other thing to note, the S9's screen design is that curved edge that flows off the sides, while the A51 has a totally flat front glass. There's no advantage here one way or another, just one more design element that's really just a matter of personal preference. Aside from the bezels and overall form factor, one thing that's more objective is the actual screen technology that each phone offers. The A51 is still a budget device after all, and that means that it isn't pushing the limits with its display. While it does still offer an exceptional Super AMOLED panel, just like the flagship S9, interestingly enough, it comes in at a resolution of 2400 by 1080 and packs just 405 pixels per inch. The S9's display offers a maximum resolution of 2960 by 1440, packing in some 570 pixels per inch in its significantly smaller form factor. Now, don't get me wrong, both of these phones do look great. The Super AMOLED panels here are fantastic from every angle, and I'm continually impressed by how good of a display Samsung can offer on their A series phones. But the S9 is a flagship device, and even being 2 years old, it still offers a higher resolution, more detailed display than the A51. That means that side by side, the S9 is going to look sharper and more crisp. It can display more detail with your content, and all in all is the better viewing experience. I think this is something that's obvious when you put these phones side by side in person and see it for yourself, and it goes to show just how solid the S9's display was, and still is, even in 2020. If you're strictly looking at screen size, if you want the biggest display that still looks good and you don't necessarily care about resolution, the A51 is a great option. But if you're looking for the best resolution regardless of screen size, the S9 is your answer. Because the S9 is a flagship phone, like I said, and the A51 is more of a budget offering, there's also a decent difference in the materials and the build quality. While the A51 looks like it might be made of glass and metal, it's actually an all plastic phone that's sort of designed to mimic glass. The S9, like pretty much every flagship phone for the last few years now, offers a more premium, true metal and glass form factor. Realistically, there isn't necessarily an advantage here with either phone. I think the metal and aluminum build of the S9 feels a little nicer. It's a bit more premium in the hand. But the A51 doesn't feel cheap at all, and might be more durable than glass anyway. Again, I think this is just going to come down to what you want out of your phone with the material more than anything else. The build of each phone does yield some other feature differences though. For example, the S9 is IP68 water and dust resistant, while the A51 has no certification whatsoever. The S9 also supports wireless Qi charging, while the A51 does not. And I think both of those things mainly have to do with the A51 being designed as a cost-saving phone. With the S9, there's just really no compromises. Taking a look around at everything else, because these are Samsung phones, they are set up pretty similarly. You've got your volume and power buttons basically in the same place, just on opposite sides, and the S9 has one additional dedicated Bixby button as well. On the bottom, both phones have a headphone jack and USB-C port for charging. The only other real difference is that while the A51 has just the one single speaker at the bottom, the S9 speaker setup is stereo, with one at the bottom and an additional speaker in the earpiece. This means that the S9 offers the better listening experience out loud overall with the stereo sound. The A51's single speaker is mostly fine, but the S9 is louder, clearer, and offers a more immersive, out loud listening experience. Around back, obviously, these two phones have very different camera setups, and I'll get into all that in a bit, but you'll also notice that the S9 has the dedicated rear fingerprint setup just below the camera. The A51 still also has a fingerprint sensor, but its is hidden underneath the display. Now, I've complained a couple of times already about the in-display reader on the A51. I don't think it's all that great, and compared to the S9, which has a faster, easier to find, and more consistent setup, the choice for me here is clear. I like the old school physical sensors, so I like the setup on the S9 over the A51. Powering these two phones are two very different batteries. The A51 has a fairly respectable 4,000 milliamp capacity power plant, while the S9 comes in at a much smaller 3,000 milliamp capacity. I realize size is sometimes relative, but during everyday use, I've found that the A51 has no problem making it through to the end of the day without needing a charge, while the S9 struggles to go the distance. Unfortunately, this is probably the biggest discrepancy between the two phones, and likely the most significant negative that the S9 has. It's just not a phone with a big battery, and it isn't as consistently reliable. If you don't mind juicing up at some point during the day, that's fine, but if battery life is even a minor concern, I think the S9's limitations are worth thinking about here. And as far as their charging speeds, both phones have the 15-watt charging standard supported, so there's no real advantage there. Inside, these phones also have very different different specs. The S9, being a flagship phone, gets the flagship specs of 2 years ago, which include the Snapdragon 845 chipset, the Adreno 630 GPU, and a maximum of just 4 gigs of RAM. The A51, which is a budget phone of course, gets the latest 2020 budget specs, which include Samsung's own Exynos 9611 processor, the Mali G72 GPU, and anywhere between 4 and 8 gigs of RAM depending on your configuration. Now, unlike the A71 from the last video, which actually offered better performance, I think the A51 here lags a little bit behind the S9. The 9611, while still a good processor, doesn't seem as fast as the 2-year-old Snapdragon chip when launching apps and doing everyday tasks. And by the way, my A51 here has just 4 gigs of RAM, so that's an even and fair comparison too. I think if you go ahead and bump up the RAM to 6 or 8 gigs on the A51, you've got some potential there, possibly better performance and better app management as well. But as it stands right now, the processor and GPU and 4 gigs of RAM on the A51 I don't think are all as good as the flagship specs of 2 years ago. They're not bad, obviously, they're not significantly worse, they just seem to be a little off. And keep in mind too that both of these phones run the same Android 10 and One UI 2 update. The software experience here is basically identical, and that's awesome for the S9 in particular. This is a 2-year-old phone that's getting the latest version of Android, but it will likely be the last major update supported with this phone. And while the device is well optimized right now, a year or two down the line, the A51 will continue to see updates and improvements, while the S9 will more quickly feel outdated and unsupported. Now, I do think the S9 has the internal specs that make it worth it, but if you're looking at longevity with software and support, the A51 is going to have a longer lifespan from this point forward over the S9. In regards to the cameras, what we have here are two vastly different approaches, and this really just shows how much camera tech has changed in such a short time. The S9 packs just one single lens around back. It's a 12 megapixel variable aperture shooter with the usual specs and features you might expect, but that's it. It's just the one lens and nothing more. The A51, on the other hand, has a quad camera setup, and this includes a 48 megapixel f2.0 main lens, a 12 megapixel ultra wide camera, a 5 megapixel macro lens, and the 5 megapixel depth sensor. Now, I do think the S9 takes great pictures, even with its single lens setup. We've got everything you can ask for feature-wise too, for the most part, like live focus and night mode and HDR support, among other things, but the A51 just simply offers more. There's more lens options, more shooting modes, more features, and overall, I think more potential with a higher megapixel main lens for the average user. I know not everyone gets the most out of their smartphone cameras, that's no secret. A vast majority of people just pull out their phone, snap a pic in auto, and that's pretty much it. But if you're the kind of person who values all the lenses, the features, and the overall potential of a smartphone camera, I do think the A51 is your choice here. Again, there's nothing wrong with the S9 setup. It wasn't a bad camera then, and it isn't a bad camera even now. It just doesn't offer as much as the A51. And the front cameras are also pretty different too. There's a 32 megapixel f2.2 selfie camera on the A51 and just an 8 megapixel f1.7 aperture shooter on the S9. Now, honestly, I don't necessarily think either phone takes all that good of selfies, but again, I think there's just a bit more potential here going with the A51. So all in all, I really do think this is a tough comparison. The S9 is still a great phone, and it offers a better display and build quality and better specs too. But the A51 packs so much more with a camera setup. It has a better battery, a bigger screen, and it will continue to get software updates and support for a couple more years at least. Since price really isn't a factor, I think it's going to come down to what you personally value. And for me, that's build quality, the performance, and the display, which all favor the S9. So in the end, that's my choice. But what do you guys think? Which phone would you prefer? The S9, the A51, or maybe something entirely different? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to know your thoughts, of course. But hopefully you guys did enjoy this video. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already. And I'll see you guys later.